Hello, and welcome to Under 1000. My name's Thomas Flower, and each episode I'll read you a new piece of flash fiction. All of the stories are 1000 words or less. Today, I'll be reading Without Power. Please be aware that this episode deals with themes of death and discrimination, so if that's likely to upset you, or anyone that you're listening with, then you might want to skip this one. They were the lowest of the low. Dirty, disgusting, unclean. Once you were a harvester, there was no coming back, and thus the role was passed on from generation to generation, with no hope of moving to a better life. And yet the strange thing was how vital the harvesters were, and how aware the nation was of it. Tiambria would be nothing without those who created the very energy it ran on. Every spell cast, from the tiniest luck charm to the greatest transformation incantation, was powered by the energy that the harvesters worked such unsavoury roles to fulfill. It was difficult to argue that the harvester's work was unenviable. That much was true. The sacrificing of creatures great and small was unpleasant at best, and compounded with the grimy and dark locations this work often took place in, hidden underground, so that others wouldn't have to think about the cost of their luxury on their fellow citizens and the natural world. It was indeed a role that nobody would have chosen to take part in. Still, the energy which was taken from the beasts sent for slaughter was the only thing fueling the nation of Tiambria, keeping it strong and powerful. And the thing which would perhaps have seemed most strange to an outside observer is that rather than be rewarded for the sacrifice, doing the work that everybody else preferred to forget about, the harvesters were instead punished for it. They were forced into tiny hovels, given only enough bread and water that they might survive, and had their own spellcasting severely limited through both the lack of education and the use of primitive medical technology which restricted their innate abilities. They were punished, in effect, for doing what society was afraid to admit was necessary. Better to cast down the ones you would rather not think about than to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth at the heart of your way of life, after all. Out of sight, out of mind. As the small collection of families continued to toil away, generation after generation working themselves into gritty, joyless corpses, patience grew thinner and thinner. It was only when they were instructed that their own dead would be used for energy as well, however, that something finally snapped. What did it matter if a harvester was converted after all, the logic of those in power went? Weren't they close to beasts themselves? Their dead did not deserve a proper burial. Might as well make use of them in death, as in life. The harvesters could not take any more. When presented with the bodies of those they had once known and loved, they downed their scythes and potion jars and simply refused to work any longer. How could they, after all? Who amongst them could really cut open Mrs. Wendell or young Jemima and extract the energy from within? It was abhorrent, degrading, unhuman. They sat in a collective stewing anger and refused to do anything more. The guards were called immediately. They rationalized to themselves that they didn't want to do this, but it had to be done. Right from the highest person giving the commands to the lowest guard on the pecking order, nobody wanted to do this. And yet, strangely, they still did. Hordes of men spilled forth, a wave of disciplinary action coming from the castle and rushing forward to land on the disruptive hovel in question. It was strange how so many people could be involved in doing something that they professed to disagree with. Meanwhile, the harvesters had taken to chanting, downing tools to stand together in lines and groups, repeating over and over again, "We make your power! Give us our own!" It felt like a small thing to be doing in the face of the tragedy that had been forced upon them. But any action, no matter how small, seemed better than inaction. And so they stood and chanted, repeating the phrase over and over, despite not knowing if anyone was around to hear them. That was, until the first spray of guards trickled through the door, their staffs raised and incantations at the ready. For a moment, there was a stillness, a sudden, grasping silence, as each side tried to work out what the best course of action would be. And then, it broke loose. Guards were pelting the tiny underground shack with bursts of magical energy, which ricocheted across the room, hitting the harvesters only slightly more often than they hit themselves. Several of the protesting group ducked for cover, trying to erect a small shield of energy with the minimal power and knowledge they were able to wield. But as the sheer volume of guards overwhelmed them, they were unable to fight any longer, and were forced into cowering surrender. As they were led away, the people booed and jeered, shouting obscenities at these harvesters. Who did they think they were, after all? These disgusting creatures were barely subhuman. What right did they have to question the will of those above them and the natural order of things? But as they were being led away, a single harvester's voice rang out, rising above the assembled crowd's sneers. She called out to them all, speaking a simple message. "Remember, fellow citizens, that if they dispose of us, then they will simply have to find others to take our place. Who among you will be a harvester next?" And with that, the crowd fell silent, looking, with a moment of newly awakened fear, upon the guards they now saw might one day be leading them to a fateful punishment. And then, with a whisper of cloaks and capes, they shuffled away, trying their best to go back to normal and pretend that nothing was wrong in the nation of Tiambria. Thank you for listening to Under 1000. I'm your host, Thomas Flower. To follow the show online, look for Under 1000 Pod on Twitter or Facebook, or check out the website at under1000pod.com. If you'd like to support the show on Patreon, go to patreon.com/under1000pod, where you can sign up to read each month's stories in advance, as well as to have a thank you be read during these credits. The theme music is an instrumental version of In Between Days by Nick Tate and the Sharks. To hear the full song and more from the same EP, go to Nick Tate, NICTATE, and thesharks.bandcamp.com, or search for them on your favourite streaming platform. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and that you'll join me again next time for some more super short fiction.